Hey, hi, hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Katie and today we're taking a trip down memory lane. Today's mug is this really pretty turquoise kind of gradient mug. I love it. This was a gift and it's one of my favorites. It's the perfect size. I thought it would be really fun to take a look at BookTube's history and talk about the most hyped books ever over the course that BookTube has been around. Hello everybody, it is me from a few days later. I filmed this all in one sitting and I'm going back through and editing the footage now. There's a couple more points I want to make. You might see me chopped in throughout this video. I didn't want you to be alarmed by the hair, makeup, and clothing change, but I wanted to make sure my points were getting across as clear as possible. So that is what this is. I have two sources of inspiration for this video. The first one is a channel called Smoky Glow. She does a mix of commentary and makeup and talks about a lot of different topics on her channel. I will link it down below, but she also does these long form evolution of content where she talks about creators, brands, etc. kind of throughout their rise to fame on YouTube or in the media community, etc. I have really been enjoying Smoky Glow's content, so if you're looking for somebody who does a little bit of makeup content, a little bit of commentary content, she's your girl. And my second source of inspiration for this idea, I was watching I think it was a Q&A actually from Riley Marie. I'll link it down below. And someone asked her what she thought the most hyped book ever in her tenure on YouTube was, and she responded with the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And it definitely got me thinking of my experience on BookTube and watching bookish content to see what kind of the most hyped books were in the history of BookTube. So I took these two ideas and smashed them together. I did a ton of research and I want to kind of go through the years and talk about the different books that were popular at different times. Maybe talk about some patterns. I don't know, we'll see. I don't even know if anybody wants this, but I did have so much fun researching this video. It was very fun and nostalgic to go back in time on BookTube and see what people were talking about. For this research, I watched so many videos. I watched anticipated releases videos, I watched TBR videos, I watched best of videos, and a whole slew of content. So my intention was to find the books that were talked about the most, not necessarily the most well loved. So books that were gaining a lot of hype. In my mind, that's not just books that everybody loved, but generally books that people loved are going to be talked about a little bit more. I wanted to start in 2011 because that's when there were multiple creators talking about books on YouTube. There were some bookish related videos that I found previous to 2011, but I figured 2011 would be a good place to start. All right. All the way back in 2011, it seemed like dystopian was king still. We saw a lot of mentions and hype and excitement around dystopians. Particularly in 2010, Mockingjay, the last book in the Hunger Games series, was published. So you were seeing a lot of hype around that series after that book was published. I think it was also either in talks to be getting a movie adaptation or they were already filming, so I think that bolstered some of the hype around this series. I don't think this is any surprise because The Hunger Games in general was popular off and on BookTube, so it was definitely being mentioned quite a bit. We also had Divergent come out in 2011 following on the success of The Hunger Games. Divergent kind of took the mantle of the favorite new dystopian that was coming out in 2011. So The Hunger Games had finished, Divergent was just being published in 2011. We also see a lot of Cassandra Clare mentions. We had The City of Fallen Angels published in in 2011. Clockwork Prince was also published in 2011, and Clockwork Angel was published in 2010. The Infernal Devices series was being mentioned quite a bit. This was kind of a new spin-off series for Cassandra Clare that was a little bit different and getting a lot of love at this time. Another book that was extremely popular was Anna and the French Kiss, which was published in 2010. I was a little surprised to see this so early on the list because you do see mentions and hype surrounding this book for the next couple of years. However, I did see it a ton in 2011 videos, so I think this was probably, I would say, the most hyped year for it. The last series that came up a lot that was starting to be published in 2010 was the Iron King, Iron Fae series by Julie Kagawa. This is kind of the only year that the series is really mentioned. You don't see it trickle into the rest of the years on booktube. If I had to pick a most hyped book of 2011, I think it will have to be Divergent. There was a lot of excitement surrounding this release, and I think even though The Hunger Games was being mentioned a lot on booktube, it had already gained popularity in mainstream media. People weren't talking about it with as much fervor as Divergent. You would see people mention The Hunger Games and just be like, of course, this is my top favorites of 2011. This is a great series. Of course, you all know about this already, etc. But when they would talk about Divergent, they would be pushing people to read it, talking about how excited they were for the next books, and that gained a lot of hype around it. So that hype for Divergent does carry us into 2012 when the second book is released. So we are still seeing mentions of Divergent and the Divergent trilogy on YouTube. A couple other interesting ones. Across the Universe by Beth Revis was a YA sci-fi that was being talked about quite a bit, and Poison Study by Maria V. Schneider, it popped up in a lot of 2012 videos, which I think is interesting because this book was first published in 2005. Looking back, I am curious to see if Poison Study was one of the first book series that was really gaining a lot of hype solely from booktube, and by that I mean it wasn't being marketed and pushed by the publishers as much because it was an older series, I'm assuming. So I am wondering if maybe this was one of the first series that really gained traction on booktube because of other booktubers. I don't remember in those videos whether I saw people mention, oh, I picked this up because of this person. They could have said that, but that wasn't really something I was tracking too much. But I just thought that was something interesting, that maybe we are starting to see a little bit of traction around older series that aren't being pushed as much by the publishers, and really seeing people pick up books because of other booktubers. We are still seeing mentions of first books in new dystopian series, so not a ton of hype surrounding these series yet, but something interesting I thought is we see The Maze Runner come up a little bit, The Selection, Legend by Marie Lu, Shatter Me starts getting a little more attention, and Delirium by Lauren Oliver is also mentioned as well. So overall, I would say the most hyped genre was dystopian in 2012 still. However, there is one huge exception to this rule, and I would say probably the most hyped book of 2012, and that is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Damn, like this book was mentioned across the board for people's favorite books of 2012, anticipated releases of 2012. This book was talked about so much. I think it's because it was kind of the first of its kind. It was definitely very widely received. John Green in general was a well-known author at the time, but you did not see his works mentioned on booktube as much until The Fault in Our Stars came out. And I think this was just popular across the board. You were seeing it everywhere. It was an incredibly hyped novel, not just on booktube, but I would say in the world. Just something interesting I found. So we still are seeing the most popular people talk about YA in 2012, but there are people that are talking about adult works. The ones that I saw mentioned the most out of the adult series were Game of Thrones, which would have been gaining attention from the TV show, and Ready Player One actually came up a few times as well. Moving into 2013, there are definitely more and more people discovering booktube, and that therefore more and more content being created. So we do start to see a little bit of an expansion in hyped books, in my opinion. The 2 book series that I mentioned before are starting to gain probably the most hype in 2013, and that is the Legend trilogy by Marie Lu, and we also see Shatter Me by Taha Mafi starting to take off. Another huge dystopian series that was crowned king in 2013 is The Darkest Minds by Alexander Bracken. The first book in this series was published in 2012, but it was starting to gain traction by 2013. People were really excited about this series. Patrick Ness is talked about a lot. His Chaos Walking trilogy comes up quite a bit, but also he had a release in 2013 called More Than This, so he is being talked about quite a bit. The Fifth Wave was published this year, and that was an extremely hyped book. People were anticipating it, they were reading it, they were loving it. We are still seeing a lot of hype around dystopian and post-apocalyptic novels, but there are some exceptions this year as well. Cassandra Clare is coming back up in the hype train because she released the final book in the Infernal Devices trilogy called Clockwork Princess. We see a lot of hype around the Mara Dyer trilogy, which I think the first 2 books at this point were out, and a lot of people really hyping this up as a mystery paranormal YA. Something interesting I saw pop up a lot this year was Vampire Academy, which is curious because, again, like Poison Study popping up last year, Vampire Academy, that series was published between 2007 and 2010, so we're seeing a little bit of a delay on the hype there. 2013 is the first time we start seeing Brandon Sanderson being mentioned, specifically his adult high fantasy, the Mistborn trilogy. Okay, I want to make a clarifier here because this is a phrase that I say a lot in this entire video, and it's that I say this series or this author is first mentioned during this year, and I think what I actually meant was this is first starting to gain some hype. So it wasn't mentioned only once, it was starting to be mentioned quite a bit actually. That's why I took note of it, but it does sound like this is the first time anyone ever talked about it, which is not true. I wasn't able to watch every single video, so there is a very real possibility that somebody mentioned it before this year, but this is just when I saw it starting to gain a little bit of traction. Brandon Sanderson will consistently be mentioned slash hyped, not to the extent of some of these other series, but he is kind of a consistent thread throughout the next, you know, decade of hyped books. By far the most mentioned hyped book that I saw in 2013 was Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. This book, like The Fault in Our Stars, was everywhere. It was on so many people's best of lists. So many people want to read and need to get to lists. This book was mentioned so many times. This is a book that I have read and love, and I think it's just a magic timing of when it was released, the audience that it was geared towards, the relatability. Rainbow Rowell had seen some success in 2012 with Eleanor and Park, and this one just solidified her in the YA contemporary genre. All right, 2014, Fangirl's popularity definitely carried over into 2014. This was a huge hyped book, so it was definitely going to carry over. One thing that is interesting to me is that you do see books on this list being mentioned for like 2 to 3 years in kind of an arc, and I think that's because you have the first kind of mentions and rumblings about it in the first year, and then you have the big hype the next year, everybody's reading it, everyone's talking about it, and then you have the stragglers of people who are, you know, just coming into the space and watching videos or had been putting off hyped books for one reason or another. So that's really interesting. So you do kind of see this arc of popularity, which makes sense once you think about it. But again, 2014, from now on, booktube is just expanding and there are more people in more niche genres. So there's gonna be an expansion. We aren't seeing as much of that YA only hype as well as the dystopian post-apocalyptic hype that we are seeing early on booktube. The Lunar Chronicles start to get mentioned. Cinder by Marissa Meyer was mentioned quite a bit. At this time, I think 2 of the 4 books had come out. They were being extremely hyped as fairy tale retellings, which is a popular genre at this time. People raved about this series, I think because it was diverse and it had a sci-fi twist to a fairy tale retelling. People really enjoyed it. We see our first mentions of Morgan Matson. Her book Since You've Been Gone, that was published in 2014, was widely well received, and you do see people going back and reading her previous published works after reading Since You've Been Gone a lot, is what I noticed. This is the year we start seeing a ton of hype around Sarah J. Maas. She had published Heir of Fire, which is I think a lot of people's favorite books in that series, as well as the collection of short stories. So you're starting to see more and more people talk about Sarah J. Maas, and we're seeing a little bit of a shift into more fantasy being talked about. Cassandra Clare, again, City of Heavenly Fire came out in 2014. By this time, Cassandra Clare had pretty much, I would call, a cult following, a very dedicated group of readers. So you were seeing people talk about her books pretty much anytime they were published. She would come up on best of lists, anticipated releases lists, and I think that's still something that's true to this day. Okay, 2014 is when we have our first mention of V.E. Schwab. She's showing up on anticipated releases list for The Archived. Vicious came out in 2013. That was getting a lot of praise. So she is starting to gain momentum, and very much like Brandon Sanderson the year before, her name will continue to pop up on this list up until now. By 2014, we are seeing a lot of the bigger, more popular booktubes really championing their favorite series. So you are seeing the effects of that trickle down, I think just solely because of how much these booktubers were talking about these books. I think We Were Liars fits into that category, Daughter of Smoke and Bone, as well as Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I think there are more titles that probably would fit into this category, but those are the 3 that I really noticed a lot coming up in 2014. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I think this one gained popularity because it was widely known to be a novel that was written during NaNoWriMo, and NaNoWriMo was gaining more traction as the years go on. So the Night Circus started gaining some more popularity. Another trend that you do start to see, I think, is the rise in popularity of a book because of the movie adaptation. I think that's just a natural thing that happens everywhere. But we do see a lot of mentions of Gone Girl. This book was very well loved in the thriller genre when it was published. So we see a spike of mentions because the movie was coming out in October of 2014. So I think we saw more people either reading it in anticipation of the movie coming out or watching the movie and then wanting to read the book. Just a general trend that I noticed, we are seeing more fantasy being talked about. So we've got a couple of mentions of The Raven Boys, a couple of mentions of the Kiss of Deception and the Winter's Curse trilogy. Not enough to be the most hyped book. We are seeing a little bit of a shift of what's being talked about, in my opinion, at this point. Even though BookTube is expanding, there's a lot of different niches, like I said. Overall, the most popular and talked about books are shifting away from dystopian and towards fantasy. If I had to pick a most hyped book of 2014, it would probably be a tie. I'm not sure. I tried to make a tally of how many times things were mentioned. I think it would be a tie between Throne of Glass and the Lunar Chronicles. Those series came up so much in videos. Let us move on to 2015. So we are seeing more of a variety of hyped books across the board as well. Something that was a little surprising to me, but looking back, I do remember people talking about this book, was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, a literary fiction, adult fiction book that was talked about quite a bit. People really enjoyed Emily St. John Mandel's writing and the premise for this story, so it was talked about quite a bit. We also are starting to see the rise in popularity of The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. This series was published between 2012 and 2016, so I think the first 3 books were out by the time 2015 rolled around, and the hype surrounding the last book. There was a a big like prophecy or mystery that needed to be solved, so people were really anticipating this last book, which garnered hype for the series overall. The Winner's Curse was mentioned quite a bit, which is interesting. This was pitched as a fantasy book without magic, which is something people were apparently looking for at the time. That seemed to be kind of the hook of the series. People enjoyed the political intrigue around it and the fact that there weren't a lot of fantastical elements, but it was a fantasy world. 2015, we see our first mentions of Colleen Hoover, the new adult romance author that is very polarizing in this community, but her releases still get hyped to this day. The Martian show up quite a bit, which is another one that I would say is similar to Gone Girl, because this book was published in 2011. However, the movie was about to come out, so more and more people were reading the book in anticipation of the movie, and this book got so much hype. It was very, very well loved across the board for its humor, and I think it was just different. In 2015, we also see some popularity for The Wrath in the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh, as well as Dumplin. We are also starting to get some more diversity in our hyped books and reading as well. I think people are looking for more diverse reads. BookTube in general is becoming more diverse, so this is a good thing. We are seeing more diverse hyped books. We also saw the publication of Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This was another something different, I think, that people were looking for because of the format being mixed media, told in such this interesting dynamic way. People really enjoyed Illuminae. I can't not talk about A Court of Thorns and Roses. Sarah J. Maas released Queen of Shadows and A Court of Thorns and Roses in 2015, two very hyped, very, very well received books. We are seeing that continuation of the trend of fairy tale retellings, because A Court of Thorns and Roses was actually pitched as a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I have three kind of interesting things to talk about in this one. The first one is Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I actually, when I was making this list, I was like, oh my gosh, Red Queen is gonna be everywhere. But actually, I only saw one popular booktuber talk about it in like an extreme positive way. A lot of other people were talking about it, but it was very much like, it was fine, it was okay, not my taste, etc. And I think the reason why I thought it was so hyped was because the publisher put a lot of money into this release around marketing and things like that. But when it comes to BookTube, it was talked about a little bit, but not nearly as much as I remembered. The next one that I want to talk about for 2015 is An Ember in the Ashes. This one was talked about so much, and distinctly it was talked about because it was a YA release, and it was either marketed or somebody word of mouth said this is a standalone fantasy. That was the hook, and everyone was so excited to have a unique standalone fantasy, which it obviously isn't. This is a 4-book series. So that was, I think, something really interesting that came out of that. But it was an extremely hyped book. People love it now, but I thought it was interesting that it came up a lot as a standalone fantasy that people wanted to read, and that's not what that series is at all. And lastly, for 2015, we start to see mentions of the Diviners series by Libba Bray. This book came out in 2012, and I think it was hyped up solely because of the cover. Saw a lot of people talk about it, haul it, etc. But you aren't seeing people really read it until 2014 and hype it up in 2015. Which I just thought was interesting, that it was hyped because of the cover, but not a ton of people read it until later. The most surprising book that was talked about a lot for me in 2015 that was mentioned so much was The Martian by Andy Weir, and the most like of course this is gonna be talked about, but it was still talked about a fuck ton, was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. And that hype for that series just escalated completely 100-fold into 2016 with the release of A Court of Mist and Fury. This installment in this series was widely well received. At this point, you were seeing a lot of mixed reviews and a little more discourse surrounding Sarah J Maas and her works were popping up at this time, but overall, A Court of Mist and Fury is probably considered one of her better works, if not her best work. So you were still seeing a lot of hype around that series. Again, she was still getting some hype for Throne of Glass, but A Court of Mist and Fury just took the cake for her this year. This Savage Song by V.E. Schwab was mentioned quite a bit, so still seeing that thread of V.E. Schwab. Six of Crows is starting to be mentioned, so Six of Crows was getting a little bit of attention in 2015, but we really see it take off in 2016. I think people were looking for more diverse cast of characters. That was one of the main criticisms of Sarah J Maas's work, so Six of Crows kind of answered with that, and a lot of people really enjoyed this duology. We have two kind of outliers I would say in 2016. The first one is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon, a YA contemporary that took off in 2016. This was mentioned so much. We also start to see more support for Night Film by Marisha Pessel. That book was published in 2013, but you're starting to see more and more mentions of it in 2016. I have a crazy theory about this, but I'm pretty sure it's just a theory. I think the hype around that book can just be attributed to more people reading different things on booktube, more people joining booktube, reading different things. You're seeing more people talk about different stuff. But Night Film is also mixed media, so it has like newspaper articles and blog posts and things like that. So I'm wondering if it was either being recommended a lot in conjunction with Illuminae because of the format, or people were picking it up because of that. I'm not really sure. I didn't see any connections between Night Film and Illuminae, but hey, you never know. Other than A Court of Mist and Fury, the most hyped book of 2016 was Six of Crows, that duology. That book was everywhere. People's anticipated reads, books I need to read, best books of 2016. It was all over the place. 2017 was a really interesting year. In 2017, we are shifting away more from the fantasy hype and into a contemporary kind of age of hyped books on booktube. My theory on this is that there were a lot of already established authors like Leigh Bardugo, Cassandra Clare, Sarah J Maas, Brandon Sanderson, Game of Thrones, etc. in the fantasy genre that were very well established, and people were anticipating those releases, but it wasn't as hyped up as some new releases. So I think it's just kind of similar to like back in 2011, like I mentioned with the Hunger Games, is that people were like, of course I'm anticipating this, like it's one of my favorite series, but let me tell you about this brand new, you know, contemporary that's really amazing. There just seemed to be a little more excitement around the contemporary, and I think it's just a natural shift happening in the hyped book space. First up, we have Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda. This one was starting to be mentioned in 2016, but really gained traction in 2017. We see things like Geekerella, Adam Silvera gains a lot of popularity in 2017. When Dimple Met Rishi, Eliza and Her Monsters is mentioned a ton. Little and Lion, The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue was mentioned so much in 2017, which isn't really contemporary, but I would kind of lump it into this like quirky-ish genre. We also had the release of Turtles All the Way Down, which was hyped, I think, solely for the fact that it was John Green and he hadn't released anything since The Fault in Our Stars in 2012. It was not as hyped and well received as The Fault in Our Stars, but people were talking about this book because it was kind of his return to the genre. We also see a huge push for Strange the Dreamer. And another one that was mentioned a lot was actually The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin was starting to to get a lot of traction on booktube. A couple of others that were mentioned a handful of times that are just in different genres: dark matter, homegoing, little fires everywhere. Some different genres are starting to be talked about more and more. Nevernight, every heart a doorway. Those were mentioned quite a bit. 2017, we also saw the release of Zenith by Sasha Alsberg and Lindsay Cummings. This book was hyped up, I think, simply because this was the first ever major booktuber that got a book deal, and she was talking about it a lot. Her friends were talking about it a lot. So it wasn't extremely well received, but I would consider it hyped up just because of the amount that it was being talked about. Oh, we are also, ooh gosh, I can't believe I forgot about this. It's because she's all the way back here because she's mentioned so much. A Darker Shade of Magic series by V.E. Schwab was talked about out the wazoo in 2017. I think the first 2 books had come out, and V.E. Schwab was establishing herself as one of BookTube's favorite authors by this time. But by far the most popular, most hyped, and I think well-deserved hype in the BookTube community in 2017 was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This was a very poignant and perfectly timed release for this book. This book everyone was reading, and I think that's a really good thing because the conversations that stemmed from reading that book were really important. Okay, we are getting there. So by 2018, I feel like I have to keep making this point, but BookTube is exploding, expanding, and just so many people are reading so many different things. There's so many niche genres, which means that separate things are being hyped up in separate circles. So again, I tried my best to do my research. If I forgot something, I am so sorry. I watched so many videos. One of the biggest YA book that was being hyped and talked about so much was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. This book was on a lot of anticipated releases lists, a lot of people's TBRs, etc. This book was everywhere. Something that came with Children of Blood and Bone with the hype is that it was an African-inspired fantasy. In general, fantasy, both adult and YA, you were seeing a lot of medieval and European inspired fantasy. So people were really looking for different things. We saw it with the hype around The Wrath and the Dawn and The Ember and the Ashes, and that just continued on with Children of Blood and Bone, and we are still seeing that up until this day. Another surprising one, because I thought honestly this was an underhyped book, and that is The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. That was mentioned a lot, which I think is really interesting because I don't remember it being as hyped as it was. However, it was mentioned a lot, so it was hyped. An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green was very, very popular. I think there were several factors in going into this book. I think people were hyping it up because Hank Green is John Green's brother, but he also had his own career on YouTube, so you're getting a lot of interest in different areas of YouTube, not just on BookTube. But this book was also getting good reviews. People were also really enjoying it. So I think all those levels stacked up to a really hyped book in 2018. We see the first mentions of the Poppy War, which is interesting because if you were to ask me before I did all this research, I would say the Poppy War didn't gain popularity until 2020. But we are seeing mentions of the Poppy War. Scythe by Neil Shusterman came out, and that was really, really well received, which is really interesting because there seemed to be a lot of collective burnout on Dystopian between like 2013, 2014, and then in 2018 we're seeing this extremely hyped and popular dystopian YA series, and just found that really interesting. The Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds was being talked about. This was a YA contemporary written in verse. Red Sister by Mark Lawrence was hyped in the fantasy genre. Frederick Bachman was also gaining a lot of popularity for his work. We are seeing hype around Renegades by Marissa Meyer, mostly because of her popularity with the Lunar Chronicles. We aren't seeing as much hype as we did see with the Lunar Chronicles around Renegades, and I think because there was a middle middle book she published between this series that wasn't as well received as the Lunar Chronicles. So I think people were a little bit wary going into Renegades. I feel like we're starting to see a little more adult romance being talked about. The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang and The Hating Game were talked about quite a bit. If We Were Villains started to come up in conjunction with The Secret History. We're seeing a little more popularity around dark academia, and Radio Silence by Alice Oseman was talked about quite a bit as well. And of course I can't talk about 2018 without talking about the booktube darling book, one of the main sources of inspiration for this video, and that is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This was definitely the most hyped book of 2018 across the board, and I agree with, I think, what Riley said in her video. This seemed to cross all genres of booktube. So the romance people were reading it, the YA people were reading it, the fantasy people were reading it. It seemed to be kind of a collective book that brought the entire community together, which is really fun and interesting. I don't think I would have picked this book up if I wasn't watching booktube, but I loved it. I adored it. It's an incredible book, and I think the hype that it got was very well deserved. The popularity of Scythe magnified itself twofold, increased by twofold by 2019. This series was on an upward trajectory, and a lot of people were talking about it. We also see the increase in mentions of The Cruel Prince. This is the first time The Cruel Prince is really being hyped up in the YA world, and a lot of people are talking about the series and anticipating the release of the final book for 2020. That, I think, was one of the main reasons it was being talked about so much, because it had an anticipated finale book coming out. We're starting to see more people read the first and second book in the series. Riley Sager exploded in popularity in 2019. I think that's because of his release Lock Every Door was the reason behind that. But similar to Morgan Matson a while ago, people were reading his new release and then reading his back catalog, and that was kind of generating even more hype around him and his mysteries. Adult romances were being talked about a ton. The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren was hugely popular. Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, huge popular release. And The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware was mentioned a ton. Wilder Girls a lot. Circe by Madeline Miller gained a lot of traction in 2019. The Beautiful by Renee Audier, which is really interesting because this had a similar effect as Scythe, I believe, as we see way before, you know, you had the popularity of Twilight and Vampire Academy and the Vampire Diaries, Hush Hush, all of those paranormal adventure romance YA books, and you see the collective burnout of that genre being so oversaturated. But then we see in 2019 a very popular author writing about vampires again, and so that was kind of the hook for this book, is that it was going to be a historical, like, gothic vampire-ish book, and I think people had enough time away from that genre to want to pick up something like that again. We had the release of Ninth House in 2019, which was Leigh Bardugo's first adult novel, and that got a lot of attention. I think because Leigh herself was talking about how much of her soul that she put into this project. She had garnered a lot of attention from the Six of Crows duology, so people were starting to be interested in anything that she would put out. This actually garnered a little bit of controversy. This was when people were getting arcs of Ninth House and selling it for hundreds of dollars, but that just goes to show you how wanted this book was. This book was on so many anticipated releases lists. So many people wanted to pick this up because it was Leigh Bardugo and something different from her. On the back of the success of The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, we are also seeing almost similar levels of hype for Daisy Jones and the Six. This book was everywhere. We saw it a lot because it was the same author. I think people were interested in what she was doing next, and it was just very good timing that Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo was being hyped right before her new release. So we saw a lot of talk of Taylor Jenkins Reid over 2018-2019 time. I think we also saw the success of Daisy Jones because at this time I feel like 60s, 70s fashion and vibes and aesthetics were really popular. So that just contributed to the success of Daisy Jones. I don't think that is the sole reason, but I noticed in general that 70s was kind of a vibe that was trendy at the moment. So Daisy Jones definitely fit into that for the hype as well. If I had to pick a most hyped release of 2019, I think I would have to go with 3 based on my research. I think Daisy Jones is definitely up there. We are seeing so much hype around that book, like I just mentioned. Red, White, and Royal Blue was also mentioned a ton. This book was talked about everywhere, not just on BookTube. And also Scythe. The Scythe series was getting a lot of attention at this time, anticipating the release of the final book. There are so many people talking about so many books, it's really getting a little hard to distinguish. Moving into 2020, I want to start with House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. I think this book was talked about for similar reasons to Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Sarah J. Maas at this point has established herself again as a very popular YA author and is dipping her toes in the adult fantasy world. And I think people were really excited because her books were leaning more adult anyways with their content. I think people were really excited to see what Sarah J. Maas had in store for her first adult novel. In 2020, we had 2 extensions of series, of beloved series. The first one, Midnight Sun. Anything Stephenie Meyer does is going to be talked about, I'm sure, simply because of the sheer success and nostalgia surrounding the Twilight series. Just FYI, Stephenie Meyer pretty much exploited the Quileute tribe for the Twilight series, so I will leave a link to donate to them down below. They are trying to move their at-risk community to a place where their culture and heritage can be celebrated and protected for generations to come. So check that out, please, when you get a chance. And we also had The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins come out, which was not well received, but still anticipated, highly talked about, etc. Gideon the Ninth was something that was really hyped up and talked about a lot in 2020, a little bit in 2019 as well. There's a bleed there. Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas was talked about a lot for good reason because it was written by a trans author and was really well done from what I've seen. Some of the books in 2020 that I've seen really hyped kind of across the board: Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, Felix Ever After by Kaysen Callender, A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne Brown, The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune is getting a lot of hype, Jade City by Fonda Lee, Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. I know there's no way I can talk about all of the very well-deserved hyped books of 2020. So let me know down below what you think the most hyped book of 2020 for you was. I do have a pick for what I think the most hyped for me was, but I'll let past me tell you that. However, I think if I had to crown the most hyped book of 2020, I would put it on V.E. Schwab's head for The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This book was talked about on most anticipated releases for a extremely long time, and a lot of people are still talking about it into 2021. I think it's one of those books that will be talked about for a while. I have 4 things that I want to mention that didn't really fit into any specific year. I have 3 books and an author that, you know, were mentioned once or twice here and there, but once or twice every year, which I think can constitute some sort of mention in a hyped books video. The first one is The Book Thief by Marka Zuzak, which came out in 2006. So this was consistently talked about, not by a ton of people, but it was mentioned very consistently from 2011 all the way up to 2020. Along a very similar vein, we have The Shadow of the Wind, which was published in 2005. Now we are again consistently seeing 1 or 2 mentions of this by popular people throughout the entire decade. So I think that warranted a little bit of a mention here, an honorable mention for hyped books, if you will. And then similar, although it was released a lot later, we see mentions of The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender. We also see an underlying hype around Rick Riordan's books between 2011 to up until now. He is still very much hyped, in my opinion, on BookTube. We see a little bit more mentions of his Heroes of Olympus series back but in the, 2013, 2014 era, but he is a consistent author that is being mentioned. Also, his name attached, the Rick Riordan Presents. Those books do often tend to gain a lot of hype around them as well. I don't know if I have a overarching conclusion or theme or anything to talk about at the end. I think the only thing that I could say is something I said a bunch throughout the video. It is interesting to see the start of BookTube and how sort of small it was. And in 2011, there were a lot of people reading a lot of the same books, and we are seeing that expansion and the evolution throughout time of books that are being talked about. Going from seeing the most popular book in the world, I would say, not just on BookTube, like The Hunger Games and Divergent and all of those series back in 2011, to books and book series that I don't think would be as popular if there wasn't BookTube, if they weren't mentioned on BookTube and there wasn't a lot of hype. I just think it really shows the power of BookTube and bookish social media in general. This was really fun for me to film. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and that is going to be it for me today. If you liked this video, please give it a like. I worked really hard and did a lot of research, so I'd appreciate the like, and subscribe if you want to. You don't have to, but that is going to be it for me today. Bye!